Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. In the quiet hills of rural Pennsylvania, a forgotten asylum waits, sealed since 1997. The government denied what happened inside. The tapes were buried. But one voice survived. One patient was never discharged. And the psychiatrist who evaluated him was never seen again. This is the story of the last night inside Red Pines Asylum. Listener discretion is advised. Because once you hear the name Elias Finch, he starts to remember you. Red Pines Asylum was never supposed to be remembered. The town it sat near, Crestwood, Pennsylvania, quietly erased it from their maps years ago. Locals called it a cancer in the hills, something that had grown where it shouldn't have, something too stubborn to die when it was shut down. The government files were minimal. The record sealed. But one fact remained impossible to bury: Red Pines housed one patient long after everyone else had been transferred out or discharged. A patient who didn't belong in the system. A patient who, according to every record ever filed, had never existed. On a cold November morning in 1997, a psychiatrist named Dr. Samuel Greaves was ordered to evaluate the asylum's final case before it could be formally shut down and condemned. No one knew why the order came through so suddenly. No one asked who had signed it. Red Pines hadn't been used for years, not since a legal scandal buried it under neglect charges and whispers of patient mistreatment. There was no electricity running. No security detail assigned. Just one key, left at the sheriff's desk, and a file with only 2 words typed on the front in faded ink: Elias Finch. Most of what came afterward was never spoken aloud. The official reports never mentioned what Dr. Greaves saw. But 3 weeks after he entered Red Pines, the building was found empty. No signs of the doctor. No trace of Elias. And nothing inside but silence and dust. Those who investigated the site afterward found no living quarters set up for anyone. No running water. No heating. Just a rotting desk in the old intake office, and a single cassette tape, still running when they arrived, even though its battery compartment had long since corroded shut. The tape played only static, until 3:17 a.m. each night, when a voice, barely audible through the hiss, whispered, "He remembers you." Long before Red Pines was shuttered, it had earned a reputation even the most skeptical couldn't ignore. Former orderlies had gone missing. Medical logs had been altered, rewritten by unknown hands. One nurse was found sitting in her car outside the facility's gate in 1984, eyes open but blind, repeating the same word over and over: drawn, drawn, drawn. After that, no one volunteered to work nights. When Dr. Greaves first arrived, he wasn't briefed by anyone in person. The town sheriff, Clay Moreland, simply handed him the building key and left without speaking. The doctor later noted in his private journal that the man had looked tired, not from work, but from fear. Like someone who hadn't slept in days. That journal entry was the last one made in his own handwriting. The pages that followed were written with a different pen. A different rhythm. And a different tone. Elias Finch had been committed under emergency circumstances in 1973, according to one archived court transcript. He was never legally declared dangerous, never convicted of a crime. In fact, no birth certificate for him existed. The transcript contained only witness statements from neighbors who claimed the boy had been found standing in the road, barefoot, staring into the woods behind the Mercer family farm. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared. One woman swore she saw him standing in that exact same spot 5 years earlier, wearing the same clothes, at the same time of night. She never testified in court. She went missing a week later. For the first few days inside Red Pines, Greaves reported nothing unusual in his early recordings. The building was in disrepair, but stable. The air smelled of mold and age. The patient, Elias, was calm, cooperative, though mute. He refused to speak or make eye contact. He only drew circles, spirals, symbols, again and again. Hundreds of them. The drawings covered every wall of his room, every inch of the desk, even the underside of the mattress. The symbols never repeated exactly, but each one resembled a circular seal with jagged outer edges. When viewed together, side by side, they began to resemble a map of some kind, lines connecting them, as if each drawing was a location. A door. A mark. Elias never used words. Just charcoal. Always the same kind, always sharpened to a needlepoint, though no one ever found any sharpening tools among his belongings. Dr. Greaves began to lose sleep after the 3rd night. He complained of hearing humming in the ventilation shafts, music without melody, always starting at 3:17 a.m. He reported strange cold spots near the patient's room, and once noted that the shadows under the door moved even when there was no one inside. There were no lights, no generators, no working power in the asylum. Yet cameras set up in the hallways began recording on their own. Footage that showed nothing except Elias, standing in the hallway, unmoving, staring down the corridor for hours. The most disturbing part wasn't the footage itself. It was the timestamps. Each recording was dated years apart. And in every one, Elias looked exactly the same. The day after his initial evaluation, Dr. Greaves began noticing inconsistencies in the building's layout. The east corridor, where Elias's room was located, had only 3 cells marked in the original blueprint. But when measured again that morning, there were 4. The extra room had no number, no label, and no visible door, just a seamless wall with a slight indent near the baseboard, like a doorway had once been sealed shut from the inside. He didn't report this in his official notes. But in a margin scribble of his second journal entry, the words, "It's growing," appeared twice. Temperature changes began shortly after. Despite the Pennsylvania winter raging outside, some rooms radiated an unnatural warmth, like the breath of someone just having left. Others, especially near the patient's wing, dropped to freezing levels, even forming thin frost lines along the interior glass of observation windows. No heating system remained active. All mechanical components in Red Pines had been disconnected years earlier. Yet the climate inside responded to no natural rhythm, shifting without warning, like something breathing behind the walls. Elias never moved during these fluctuations. He remained in his chair, facing the far wall. He neither acknowledged nor reacted to any attempt at communication. He hadn't eaten. No food deliveries had been logged. No waste removal was ever needed. He simply sat, his arms occasionally twitching in rhythm with the ticking of a clock that no longer existed. The silence around him wasn't just empty, it felt dense, like the air resisted sound itself. Like it didn't want anyone listening. On the 4th night, Greaves reported hearing the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the western hall. He assumed it was a memory, or perhaps the building shifting in the cold. But when he approached the direction of the sound, the footsteps stopped mid-step, cut off as if paused. He later played back his field recorder and found the sounds were indeed there, pacing slowly toward his location, stopping exactly when he had. The next morning, he discovered something carved into his office door. Not scratched, not etched, but engraved deeply with precision, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. A symbol matching the ones Elias had drawn, only this one was cleaner, perfectly measured. The wood around it was smooth, as if aged unnaturally. No tools had been taken from the storage closets. Nothing could have made a mark like that without splintering the door entirely. Yet it was there, clean, symmetrical, and ice-cold to the touch. Records from the asylum's original operations indicated that Elias Finch had been admitted without a full intake process. He arrived with no guardian, no file, no family. The entry notes were typewritten, dated March 7, 1973, but the ink had faded into almost nothing. What was visible hinted at contradictions. Under age, the number 10 was typed, but overwritten twice with something unreadable. Under condition, someone had typed the word inhuman, then scratched it out with red pen. Staff signatures were missing. The only written comment left intact read, "He doesn't blink." Dr. Greaves began referencing sleep deprivation in his private recordings. He claimed that every time he closed his eyes, he would see the layout of Red Pines, but not as it was. In his dreams, the corridors were longer, and they curved downward. The basement level no longer ended at the maintenance room. It spiraled. Deeper and deeper. With every dream, he remembered more turns, more doors, and more whispers leaking through the floorboards. Once, he woke up standing in the east corridor, barefoot, with mud on his hands. The sheriff never returned for a follow-up. When Greaves called his office, the line rang endlessly before disconnecting with a loud static pop. No voicemail. No automated message. The sheriff's cruiser remained parked on the edge of the property, its headlights pointing at the tree line. The keys were still in the ignition, engine off, battery dead. The radio inside had recorded one final message on loop, a fragment of someone breathing, layered over the hum of wind, and a soft, childish laugh. A breakthrough came on the 6th day when Greaves, searching through a broken cabinet in the intake wing, discovered a torn photograph tucked inside a Bible's hollowed-out center. The photo showed a group of asylum staff posed in front of the facility in 1975. Most of the faces were faded. The paper had warped from moisture. But in the back row, standing beside the head nurse, was a boy with hollow eyes, circled in red ink. He was wearing a hospital gown. Elias. But someone had written the word "visitor" across his chest in black pen, and the caption beneath the photo didn't list his name. In a small drawer beneath the cabinet, he found a second item, a patient wristband. The tag read, E. Finch. But the date beneath it wasn't from 1973. It said December 17, 1941. The ink was dry, brittle. The band was real. And the edges were stained with something that looked like rust, or old blood. That night, Dr. Greaves locked his office door. He stopped writing. His final recording was brief and filled with static. But one line came through, sharp and clear, whispered in a breath not his own. He's not a patient. He's a key. By the seventh day, time had begun to distort. The clocks inside Red Pines had long stopped working, but now even Greaves' personal watch failed to tick consistently. Seconds stretched out unnaturally, while other moments vanished entirely. He would write a word and suddenly find a full page filled, though he had no memory of writing the rest. Hours slipped by without meaning. Sometimes the sun didn't rise at all. Sometimes it did, but the light outside was gray and flickering, like film stuck on a single broken frame. The building was changing. Subtle at first, shadows lingering too long, corners appearing where walls had once been flat. But it escalated. Doorways widened or shrank overnight. A hallway that used to lead to the laundry area now ended in a smooth wall of wet cement, freshly cured. Pipes hummed with voices when no one was near them. And something scraped along the underside of the floor every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., a dragging, wet sound that stopped if listened to too closely. Elias, the boy who hadn't spoken in nearly a week, began to hum. It started with a low, repetitive tone, barely above a whisper. The same 4 notes, played over and over, like a lullaby remembered from a dream. The melody had no clear origin, no identifiable song. But it was familiar. Ancient. As though it existed long before music had names. When Greaves heard it through the observation speaker, his hands began to shake. He turned the speaker off, but the sound continued. Not through the system, inside his skull. He began pressing cotton into his ears. It didn't help. Soon, the melody wasn't just coming from Elias. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the drains. And worst of all, from behind mirrors. Even the air began to vibrate slightly with each note. The frequency was unnatural, and prolonged exposure brought headaches, dizziness, and a metallic taste in the mouth. The photograph of the boy found earlier kept resurfacing, no matter where it was placed. Greaves had sealed it inside a locked drawer, burned a copy in the furnace, and even attempted to flush one down the toilet. But each morning, the same original photo would reappear on his desk, untouched, unstained, and somehow newer. Each time it returned, more faces in the photo had faded completely, leaving behind only outlines like chalk body tracings. In a desperate attempt to restore some sense of reality, Greaves consulted old patient logs stored in the West Wing basement. That wing had been condemned due to water damage, but he forced the rusted gate open and descended anyway. The staircase was slick with moss, and the air tasted of mold and iron. Deep in the archive chamber, he found a file, one not listed in the digitized index. The file had no cover. Inside, a series of crude drawings on hospital chart paper, symbols, spirals, malformed runes written in what looked like fingernail scratches. At the bottom of each sheet, the initials EF appeared. But some pages bore a different date, 1904, 1896, 1881. Dates before Red Pines had even been constructed. The ink was still wet on a few pages. Somewhere in the building, a second humming began. A harmony. A lower, slower version of Elias's lullaby. It echoed through the air vents, vibrated the tiles, and grew louder when anyone stood too long near room 4. That was the unmarked room, the one with no door. And now, the indent in the wall had deepened. A faint seam had appeared. It pulsed. Like a heartbeat. The file also contained a short passage written in Latin. Greaves translated it roughly using an old hymnal and found it to be a warning. Not a prayer. Not a curse. Just a single directive repeated 3 times. Do not observe him directly. Do not speak his name aloud. Do not answer if he knocks. The knocking began on the 8th night. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on his office door at exactly 3:17 a.m. The first time, Greaves froze. The second time, he wept. The third, he pressed his ear to the wood and heard breathing. Not loud or frantic, just steady, calm, and close. It sounded like a child breathing through a smile. No one else had been recorded entering or exiting the building in over a week. The asylum's gates were rusted shut, and no vehicles remained outside. Yet footprints began appearing in the dust. Small, bare feet. They walked in circles around Elias's room and always stopped directly in front of Greaves' door. The sealed room, the one without a name, now had a crack down its center. Greaves couldn't stop himself from approaching it. Every time he tried to focus on anything else, he found himself drawn back to that hallway. And the closer he came to the seam, the colder the air became. It wasn't just the absence of warmth, it was the presence of something else. A depthless cold, like the kind found miles beneath the earth. It didn't chill the skin. It stopped the heartbeat. That was the night Greaves carved the symbol into his own chest. Not deeply. Just enough for it to stay. With trembling hands, he drew the circle with 3 intersecting lines, just like the one on his office door. He believed it would protect him, though he never said why. He stopped eating after that. Stopped sleeping. And when he looked in the mirror the next morning, his reflection didn't blink when he did. By the 9th day, the asylum had transformed into something unrecognizable. The structure was still the same on the outside, gray bricks, boarded windows, iron gates, but inside, red pines no longer obeyed the laws of architecture or logic. Hallways shifted lengths, looping back into themselves. Doors led to staircases that ascended endlessly, or descended into pitch blackness that swallowed light. Some rooms appeared twice, mirroring each other with reversed furniture and bleeding walls. Others were missing entirely, with only hollow echoes where memories of them used to be. Elias no longer needed to eat or sleep. No one could recall the last time he blinked. He sat cross-legged in the center of his cell, humming his unnatural tune while staring at a fixed point in the corner of the room. Anyone who stood near him too long began to hear whispers in their own voice, thoughts they had never thought, confessions they had never made. One orderly clawed at his ears until they bled, insisting someone was speaking his deepest secrets in a mocking tone. He was found unconscious with his nails lodged in his eardrums, smiling. The walls began to bleed memory. Paint peeled back to reveal names carved by unseen hands. Hundreds of names, most of which were not in the asylum's records. Dates stretched back before the asylum's founding. Some of the carvings glowed faintly when the lullaby hummed through the air, like veins pulsing with light. The camera feed from Elias's room corrupted every night at 3:17 a.m. The footage became distorted with static and flickering shadows. When reviewed frame by frame, a second figure would sometimes appear in the room with him. Not a person, not entirely. A shape, tall, thin, featureless, standing at impossible angles. Sometimes it hovered inches above the floor. Sometimes it mimicked Elias's movements a fraction of a second before he made them. The photograph returned again, this time larger, and with more blank faces. It no longer rested on Greaves's desk, but followed him. Taped to the inside of his locker. Folded inside his coat pocket. Reflected in windows. And the image itself had changed. The background now depicted the asylum, though much older, with overgrown ivy and crumbled walls, suggesting a time after its abandonment. Yet Elias remained at the center, untouched by age, watching with eyes that no longer appeared human. Strange insects began to appear in the building. Paper-thin, translucent creatures with too many legs and no faces. They moved silently, crawling through light fixtures, hiding in vents, and clustering around the seams in the walls. Their movement followed the rhythm of Elias's tune. When crushed, they released a thick, black ichor that vanished upon touching the floor. One of the nurses, after killing 3, began to speak backward and refused to walk on tiled floors. Electrical systems failed, then returned. Typewriters typed on their own. Phones rang from disconnected lines. Old radios played broadcasts that hadn't aired in decades, news of disasters that had never happened. One looped announcement spoke of a fire in Red Pines Asylum, dated 20 years in the future. It listed 13 confirmed deaths, including Dr. Greaves, who had not left the building in days. The unmarked room continued to change. Its crack had split wider, revealing a black void that gave off a soundless hum. The hum synchronized with Elias's lullaby, pulsing in slow, deliberate beats. Lights near the room dimmed permanently. The temperature dropped further with each passing night, and frost formed along the corridor walls despite the central heating system being intact. No one dared enter the hallway for more than a few minutes. Those who tried came back confused, missing time, and with blood dripping from their nostrils. Greaves began to write. Not his usual medical notes, but long, winding passages in a language no one could identify. Hundreds of pages appeared in his office, all penned in his handwriting, yet he had no memory of producing them. The characters on the page swirled and twisted when looked at directly, giving readers nosebleeds, migraines, or temporary blindness. Some of the words matched the runes found in the old patient file. Some resembled the symbols drawn on Elias's walls in charcoal. Outside, a storm gathered. Clouds thickened unnaturally fast, forming strange spiral patterns above the building. Animals avoided the grounds. Birds fell from the sky near the roof. And one morning, the reflection of red pines in a rain puddle showed a completely different structure, twisted, burned, and with a new wing that did not exist in the physical world. That wing had windows. Behind those windows, something moved. Staff began disappearing. Not just physically, but from memory. A receptionist who had worked there for 5 years was suddenly unlisted in the staff database. Her nameplate vanished. Her belongings were gone. Photographs in which she appeared now showed a smudge or empty space. Only one person remembered her clearly, a janitor who spent most of his time in the boiler room. He hanged himself the same night, leaving a note that simply read, "They erased her too late. I still saw." The asylum wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was becoming something else, something sentient. It fed on memory, time, and attention. It watched those who watched it. The more Greaves documented, the more the building mutated in response. It didn't want to be known. And Elias wasn't the cause. He was the invitation. The door was opening. And whatever was behind it, had been waiting for a very long time. The lullaby had found a new rhythm. It no longer echoed solely from Elias's cell, it emanated from the walls, from the ventilation ducts, from beneath the floorboards. The melody changed tone depending on where it was heard. In the east wing, it sounded like a child humming softly through tears. In the western corridor, it rang out like something metallic being dragged across a tiled floor. Those who tried to trace its source never returned the same. One nurse emerged with her eyes wide open, unblinking, whispering the lullaby's notes in Morse code. She was later found submerged in a bathtub, her lungs dry as parchment. The asylum's clocks began to desynchronize. Time fractured across rooms. Some areas ran hours ahead, while others moved in slow, painful stretches of seconds. Staff found themselves losing minutes mid-conversation. Others reported witnessing events happen out of sequence. A security guard once walked past an empty hallway, only to look again and see himself standing at the far end, staring back. The reflection turned and vanished before he could react. That guard quit the next day, but later turned up in the unmarked room, eyes white, whispering the date of his death. The files in the archives had started rearranging themselves. Case numbers were no longer in numerical order. Patient photos became blurred, then distorted. Some files listed names no one recognized, with admission dates stretching back centuries. One particularly old folder was found written entirely in bone dust, sealed with thread spun from human hair. Inside it was a photograph of Elias, standing beside a burned-out building that bore the faint, charred lettering, Red Pine Sanatorium, EST 1843. That date did not exist in the institution's history, nor in any public record. But the shadows in the background of the photograph showed outlines of faces screaming, frozen in ash. Patients became unstable in new ways. Some spoke of a second floor that didn't exist. Others described waking up in rooms that were not theirs, only to be dragged back by invisible hands. Several drew maps of corridors no one had ever walked through, yet when those diagrams were followed, new hallways emerged where there had only been solid walls the day before. One patient, long mute, screamed for the first time in his life, not in words, but in reverse speech that matched Elias's lullaby played backward. The power flickered more frequently. Security footage now included timestamps that didn't match reality. One camera recorded a full 72-hour span in just 3 minutes, showing shadows moving independently of their sources. Footsteps echoed in loops, bouncing back with unnatural delay. A male voice began to broadcast through the intercom system during blackouts, calm and deliberate, always beginning with the phrase, "This was never a hospital." There was an incident in the records room. A junior administrator, attempting to sort Elias's expanding file, found a page not in her handwriting tucked into the folder. It described her death in chilling detail, time, place, cause. Initially dismissed as a cruel prank, her body was later found in the exact manner and location described, down to the blood pattern. The death report, mysteriously, had already been signed and filed before her body was discovered. The document bore Greaves's signature, though he insisted he'd never written it. That day, Greaves stopped speaking entirely. He locked himself in his office, surrounding himself with the pages covered in the unknown script. Those who entered the office described an oppressive atmosphere, a pressure behind the eyes, and a low thrumming sound like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Greaves had begun drawing circles on the walls, concentric, overlapping, some containing symbols that pulsed when exposed to light. He stared at them for hours, his lips moving silently, hands twitching in time with Elias's tune. A delivery truck arrived unexpectedly. No delivery was scheduled. The driver's manifest listed, return shipment, subject E001. No one knew what it meant. The back of the truck was empty save for chains bolted to the floor and a single iron mask, too large for any human head, rusted and inscribed with the same script as Elias's walls. The vehicle vanished before it could be impounded. Its license plate did not exist in any state database. Nightly now, shadows pressed against the frosted glass of the front doors. Human in shape, but motionless, as if watching. Staff reported dreams of standing outside Red Pines, trying to get in, but unable to remember why. Others saw themselves already inside, from the outside, trapped behind barred windows, screaming soundlessly. One janitor woke up to find red handprints on the inside of his eyelids, burned into the skin. He was later found writing on the walls with his own teeth, spelling the words, "He never left. He only waits." The deeper one went into the asylum, the older it felt. Dust returned instantly after cleaning. Light bulbs died in seconds. The walls beneath the top layer of paint revealed bricks that shouldn't have existed, mismatched stonework, some etched with tally marks that extended into the thousands. The very architecture defied geometry. Doors led into spaces too large for the building's footprint. Ceiling beams arched impossibly, and floors sloped where they should have been level. And yet, despite all of it, Elias remained. Still seated. Still humming. Still staring at the same spot in the room. As though none of it mattered. As though he was waiting for something. Or someone. Every night, that spot he stared at grew darker. Not in light, but in memory. Cameras failed to capture it. Notes written about it faded from paper. Conversations about it were forgotten mid-sentence. The void was not spreading, it was erasing, and no one knew how much longer they had before it erased the rest of them. The local wildlife began avoiding the perimeter. Birds that once nested in the trees around Red Pines vanished. The grass turned brittle, gray, and eventually stopped growing entirely. The forest line retreated as if pushed back by something unseen, leaving behind a dead zone of silence. Animals found near the grounds were malformed, missing eyes, with extra limbs, their bones oddly soft. Veterinarians who studied them later developed nosebleeds that wouldn't stop until they blacked out. One researcher reportedly wrote the words, "It's not just him," on his own chest with broken glass before falling into a coma. Letters arrived at the front desk bearing no postage or return address. The handwriting varied, but the message remained consistent: "We told you to bury it, not build on it." No one could identify who "we" referred to. These messages became more frequent, more desperate. Some came written in languages no one recognized, one using an alphabet that shifted when stared at too long. When archived, the paper decayed at an unnatural rate, turning to fine black dust within days. One of the envelopes contained a single molar, human, perfectly preserved, engraved with coordinates that pointed to the asylum's foundation. Within the asylum, technology began to act erratically. Electronic devices refused to function properly. Radios picked up broadcasts that had not aired in decades, emergency messages from long-dead stations, voices begging for help with static-cracked urgency. Computers displayed old patient records not stored digitally, listing treatment regimens involving rituals, salt lines, and forbidden names. One monitor displayed a countdown with no explanation, starting at 666:00:00. No one knew what it was counting toward. By the time they noticed it, the numbers had already begun ticking down. Maintenance crews refused to enter the lower subbasements. Something about the air shifted below the fourth level, it grew wet and warm, despite the lack of any functioning HVAC. The pipes groaned continuously, as if alive. Drips echoed in patterns that formed recognizable rhythms. One worker claimed the shadows cast by his flashlight began moving independently of the beam. Another quit on the spot after he dropped a wrench and it never hit the floor. It simply vanished. When they tried to map the blueprints to seal off that area, they discovered new rooms added with no corresponding construction records. A child's voice began appearing on patient logs. No child was ever admitted, yet multiple staff members heard laughter in the walls. Toys began appearing in unlikely places, an old wooden spinning top on the operating table, a cracked porcelain doll in the staff kitchen. Each toy was tagged with a name that didn't exist in any hospital database, but when entered into Elias's file, matched the aliases listed under known identities. This discovery raised questions no one wanted to answer. Then the memories started shifting. Staff began forgetting who they were before working at Red Pines. Birthdays blurred. Addresses disappeared from their minds. Some forgot how they got hired or why they stayed. A nurse who had worked there for 12 years opened her locker and found contents that didn't belong to her, photographs of a family she didn't recognize, labeled in her handwriting. When she tried to go home, she couldn't find her house. GPS led her in circles. Eventually, her car ran out of gas near a lake that didn't appear on any map. Red Pines itself started to rewrite its own past. Old yearbooks in nearby towns had pages missing. News archives returned errors when searched for the asylum's founding. Employees who quit found it impossible to explain where they had worked. Some spoke only in metaphors when trying to describe their time there. One said, "It was like being employed by a dream that had teeth." Another wept uncontrollably when asked for the address. The building had become untraceable, visible only to those it chose. Elias's presence extended beyond the walls. People unrelated to the asylum began dreaming of him. In towns miles away, children drew him in chalk, same sunken eyes, same torn uniform. In one town, every mirror in a single neighborhood cracked at once, spidering into a shape that matched the layout of Elias's cell. Reports of sleepwalking increased, with individuals found standing outside hospitals, staring upward at nothing. Some whispered the same phrase, "He's still listening." One psychiatrist who had never visited Red Pines reported waking up with his notes altered. A detailed analysis on schizophrenia had been replaced with a full psychological profile of Elias. The handwriting was his, but he had no memory of writing it. The last page of the file was a single sentence, scrawled repeatedly until it filled the page: "The patient is the cure." More disappearances followed. Not just staff or patients, entire records, entire histories. The names of key personnel faded from ID badges, their offices sealed, as if they had never existed. But their voices lingered in the vents, calling out for help. Audio recordings played backwards contained hidden messages, voices pleading not to be remembered, but to be erased. One technician ran analysis on the white noise surrounding Elias's cell and discovered it matched the brainwave frequency of people in REM sleep. Red Pines had become a dream incubator, a psychic parasite feeding on human memory, bleeding into the waking world. The longer someone remained inside, the less they existed in any verifiable way. Photographs taken inside would blur the moment they left the grounds. Phone calls made to family were filled with static or silence. Some calls were returned from disconnected numbers, with the caller asking only one thing: "What did he tell you?" No one ever admitted what Elias said. But they all reacted the same. Silence. Averted eyes. A flicker of something ancient and wrong behind their expressions. Not fear. Recognition. The asylum's architecture began to change. Hallways that were once straight curved subtly, forming loops that trapped those walking them for hours. Staircases led to floors that didn't officially exist, with no windows and lights that hummed at an almost imperceptible frequency, triggering migraines and hallucinations. Doors appeared where none had ever been. They were always locked, always cold to the touch, and always seemed to move slightly, as if breathing. Keys found in forgotten drawers didn't match any known locks, yet dreams whispered which doors they might open. The original blueprints were compared to current layouts, and the differences were staggering. Entire wings had manifested over time, unregistered, undocumented, yet fully functional. Examination rooms bore stains that no cleaning agent could remove. Symbols carved deep into tile and concrete weren't visible unless seen from peripheral vision. When directly observed, the carvings vanished. People began to leave maps for themselves in chalk on the walls, desperate to remember paths they'd walked only minutes before. These chalk marks were always gone the next day, replaced with childlike drawings of teeth, eyes, and figures in straitjackets. Security footage began to fragment. Cameras recorded empty hallways, yet the sound of heavy breathing filled the speakers. On one occasion, all monitors displayed the same grainy footage, a figure crawling backward through a vent, face hidden, muttering a countdown in reverse. The tech team tried to isolate the feed but found no source. When they played it frame by frame, they discovered that every 13th frame showed a still image of Elias's face superimposed over the footage, staring directly at the viewer, expression unchanged. The staff began to change. Their eyes seemed just a bit too wide, their posture a little too stiff. Some stopped blinking. Others hummed the same three-note melody under their breath. When asked about it, none could remember doing so. A few reported missing time, blacking out only to find themselves standing in rooms they'd never entered. Others heard their own names whispered from beneath floorboards or saw flashes of themselves in mirrors doing things they hadn't yet done. One doctor, formerly head of the psychiatric evaluation unit, began speaking in tongues during meetings. He scribbled equations on walls, calculating something no one understood, involving dates, moon phases, and patient numbers. The equations, once translated by a fringe linguist, spelled out a prediction: he will cross over when memory equals mass. No one knew what it meant, but the doctor's face aged visibly over the next 3 days. When he finally vanished, he left behind only a perfectly folded hospital gown and a page torn from Elias's intake file. Outside the asylum, things weren't better. Locals reported strange dreams that always ended at the asylum gates. Animals circled its perimeter and refused to cross. Birds flew around the grounds in wide, panicked arcs. A fire watch tower located 5 miles out recorded that the tree line around Red Pines had rearranged itself into a near-perfect spiral visible from above. Drones sent in to document this anomaly lost signal the moment they crossed the outer boundary and returned hours later with drained batteries and corrupted footage. A new file appeared in the patient archive. It had no folder, no label. Inside were pages that described future events with terrifying accuracy, missing staff reports dated weeks ahead, autopsy notes for people still alive, and detailed accounts of blackouts, nosebleeds, and mass amnesia incidents that had not yet occurred. The handwriting matched no one on the current roster but resembled Elias's script. One page listed instructions in a circular format, suggesting steps to unbind his tether, including exposure to grief, repetition of false truths, and feeding him identity. The air inside Red Pines grew heavier, denser. Breathing became slightly more difficult, like the atmosphere was thick with static. Visitors described feeling like they were being watched by the walls themselves. Sound carried unnaturally far, footsteps from floors above sounded directly beside you. Whispers echoed even in vacuum-sealed rooms. Tapping from within sealed closets persisted for hours, always in threes, always stopping when directly addressed. The most disturbing change was the mirror network. Installed in most patient rooms for observation purposes, these mirrors began reflecting incorrect images. People saw themselves standing behind their own reflections. Sometimes the mirror showed rooms that didn't exist, filled with patients who looked like distorted versions of current staff. These mirrored figures never moved in sync. Instead, they reacted independently, often turning their heads slowly to make eye contact with the observer before the mirror cracked slightly, always diagonally from top right to bottom left. Then came the clocks. Every timepiece inside Red Pines began running at different speeds. Some slowed, others reversed. A few ticked forward by hours in seconds. No two clocks matched. Wristwatches brought inside desynchronized permanently. Smartphones reset their internal time zones to dates in the 1800s. One analog clock displayed a time that corresponded with the exact moment Elias was first admitted. It never changed again, even when forcibly adjusted. It was as though time itself began to fracture in the presence of whatever was building within the asylum. Everything pointed to a convergence, a moment approaching that couldn't be stopped. Red Pines was no longer just a facility. It had become something else entirely. A structure built to contain a patient who was never human. A trap that now served as a beacon. And every breath taken within its walls drew that moment closer, etched deeper, and invited something unspeakable to step through the cracks. Whispers began to leak beyond the asylum's walls, carried on cold winds that seemed to travel unreasonably far. Local residents reported hearing fragmented voices in the dead of night, snippets of a name, a plea, sometimes a warning. Those who listened too long described a sensation of being pulled inward, as if the sound was not just reaching their ears but invading their minds. It was a presence, invisible and unyielding, that lingered long after the voices faded. An old man who lived on the edge of the nearby forest began to speak of a shadow stalking the trees, a figure with eyes like empty pits and hands that gripped air like claws. He claimed it followed him silently for days, only vanishing when he reached the town's main street. His neighbors dismissed him as a recluse losing his grip on reality, but the man's trembling hands told a different story. The night after his final warning, his house was found empty, all doors and windows locked from the inside, no signs of struggle or departure. The hospital records reflected an impossible truth. Patients once listed as long dead had reappeared in new files with altered names and changed birthdates. Staff rosters had gaps spanning days and weeks with no explanation, yet payroll records showed uninterrupted payments. Even the building's emergency logs documented entries and exits that didn't align with anyone's memories. A pattern emerged: people who left the asylum often forgot entire portions of their lives, those who returned sometimes spoke in tongues or described worlds that did not exist. At night, the asylum emitted low-frequency vibrations, barely perceptible but enough to induce nausea and disorientation. Electronic devices malfunctioned with increasing frequency. Phones displayed cryptic messages in code, lights flickered in rhythmic patterns that matched no known language, and computers produced nonsensical output until completely corrupted. Attempts to reboot systems were met with static-laced responses, as though the asylum itself was rejecting any attempt to impose order. Rumors spread among the staff about the shifting. It was said to be an event that could occur without warning, hallways twisting, rooms duplicating, ceilings collapsing only to reveal newer, stranger spaces behind them. Those who experienced the shifting described feelings of vertigo, cold sweat, and overwhelming dread. Some vanished during these episodes, reappearing days or weeks later with no memory and a new obsession with drawing spirals and eyes. They spoke of a presence named Elias, not as a man, but a force that had become intertwined with the asylum's very essence. One nurse documented a chilling experience in her personal journal, later recovered under mysterious circumstances. She wrote about hearing children's laughter emanating from the ventilation shafts, followed by the soft patter of footsteps ascending stairwells that led nowhere. Her handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, ending abruptly with the phrase, "He watches." always watching. Communication with the outside world became sporadic. Radios caught faint broadcasts of emergency distress signals from stations long off air. Attempts to contact local authorities yielded static or pre-recorded messages warning against approaching the asylum. Telephone calls placed from within were often dropped or answered by voices that repeated only one phrase, "He is waiting." Those who answered such calls reported a sudden, overwhelming sense of despair and an inability to speak for several minutes afterward. The asylum's library, once a mundane collection of medical texts, transformed into a repository of cryptic manuscripts and symbols. Books appeared with pages missing or rewritten in languages no one could decipher. Ancient tomes surfaced, detailing rituals meant to contain malevolent entities, while patient files referenced ceremonies involving salt circles, burning sage, and incantations meant to protect from unseen horrors. Staff found themselves drawn to these texts against their will, as though compelled by some unseen force. Elias's presence permeated every corner. Staff reported seeing fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, hearing footsteps when the halls were empty, and feeling cold touches on their skin. Night shifts became unbearable. Those who stayed past midnight often emerged pale and shaken, some refusing to speak of what they witnessed. One orderly vanished entirely, his belongings left undisturbed, except for a series of scratches carved into the wall spelling out, "It comes." The asylum's physical structure defied logic. Walls shifted, rooms appeared and disappeared, and the building seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Attempts to map its interior became futile as corridors rearranged themselves overnight. Equipment stored in certain rooms would be found in entirely different wings the next day. The building was no longer a place but a living entity, an organism feeding on fear, memory, and suffering. Visitors who ventured near the asylum's perimeter described an oppressive atmosphere that weighed heavily on their minds. Some experienced sudden headaches, vertigo, or an overwhelming urge to flee. Animals avoided the area entirely, even insects seemed absent. Trees closest to the building bore strange markings, like claw scratches etched into the bark, though no animal in the region could have made them. These marks appeared overnight, recurring in new patterns regularly. The asylum's history became a patchwork of erasures and fabrications. Local archives held records of disasters and mass casualties connected to the land, though details were often contradictory or missing. Witnesses who had once recounted events were replaced by silence or confusion. The land itself seemed cursed, a scar upon the earth where reality frayed and twisted. Those who had once tried to leave the asylum behind found themselves inexplicably drawn back. Dreams pulled them to its gates, memories resurfaced in fragments too vivid to ignore. They spoke of a man who was not a man, a being neither alive nor dead, who lingered at the edge of perception, watching, waiting. They called him Elias, though his true name was lost to time. The finality of this presence was becoming clear. Red Pines was not simply an asylum but a threshold. Elias was the guardian, prisoner, and predator all at once. His existence was tied to the land, the building, and the minds of those who entered. To escape meant to lose oneself, to surrender identity and memory to the abyss. As the nights grew darker and the silence heavier, a single truth echoed louder than all others: some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some patients are never truly cured. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the atmosphere around Red Pines thickened into something almost tangible, like a fog of dread that seeped into every crevice of thought. Time itself felt fractured, unreliable. Clocks lost all meaning as they spun wildly or froze completely. Staff members, once confident and grounded, found themselves slipping into confusion and paranoia. Memories blurred, conversations repeated as if trapped in a loop. The very act of recalling reality became a Herculean effort. Patient records began to fill with contradictory entries. A man admitted under one name would appear in another file under a different identity just days later. Symptoms described would shift overnight from anxiety and hallucinations to a profound amnesia bordering on possession. Doctors debated if these were symptoms of an unknown mental disorder or something far beyond science, a phenomenon that warped not just minds, but reality itself. The staff's behavior became erratic and unsettling. Some would disappear for hours, found later sitting motionless in dark corners, staring into nothingness. Others muttered incoherent phrases or screamed at unseen entities. There were reports of violent outbursts, sudden collapses, and fainting spells without medical cause. Attempts to discipline or counsel those affected proved futile. The sickness had no cure, only progression. Among the chaos, one name kept resurfacing: Elias. Not just the man who had been admitted so long ago, but a presence, an entity somehow intertwined with the asylum's fate. Whispers told of Elias as a shadow lurking beneath the surface of the building, a force capable of slipping between dimensions. Some believed he was trapped, others that he was free, feeding on the fear and despair of all who entered Red Pines. The asylum itself seemed to respond to Elias's influence. Walls pulsed with a faint heartbeat, floors creaked with invisible footsteps. Air grew thick and suffocating, carrying the faint scent of decay and cold metal. Lights flickered in rhythmic patterns, almost like a code, and electronic devices glitched uncontrollably. Cameras captured fleeting images of a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, never standing still, always watching. One night, a new phenomenon began: voices. They weren't random, but whispered conversations, fragments of arguments, cries for help, and chilling laughter that echoed through the halls. Staff reported hearing their own names called out, only to find no one there. Patients spoke of hearing conversations from other rooms, though walls separated them. Some swore they heard Elias speaking, his voice a low, guttural hum that promised salvation and destruction in the same breath. Attempts to leave the asylum were met with resistance. Doors once easy to open suddenly locked tight. Windows that should have provided escape revealed only impenetrable darkness. Some who tried to flee found themselves inexplicably back inside moments later, disoriented and breathless, as if the building itself had swallowed them whole and spat them back into its maze. Outside the walls, the surrounding forest seemed to react. Trees bent unnaturally, branches twisting like claws reaching for the sky. Animals fled the area, their absence leaving an eerie silence. Locals avoided the place altogether, warning newcomers of the curse that had befallen Red Pines. Stories circulated of people vanishing after venturing too close, their bodies found days later with expressions frozen in terror. In the staff lounge, a journal was discovered, old, leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. It belonged to a former caretaker who had vanished years before. The entries chronicled escalating horrors, describing Elias not as a patient, but as a gatekeeper of a dark realm. The caretaker wrote of rituals meant to bind Elias, of sacrifices and blood rites performed beneath the asylum's foundations. The final entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness and release, written in shaky, frantic script. The atmosphere thickened with an oppressive energy, as if the asylum were alive and aware. Floors groaned under invisible weight, walls whispered secrets in languages no one could understand. Shadows lengthened and stretched, forming shapes that resembled twisted figures and pleading faces. The line between nightmare and reality blurred so thoroughly that even the most skeptical staff members began to question their own sanity. Among the few who remained functional, a sense of impending doom settled. It was not just a place of confinement anymore, it was a trap, a living nightmare designed to imprison something far worse than madness. Elias was no longer merely a man or a ghost, he was a catalyst, a rupture in the fabric of existence that threatened to unravel everything around him. Every breath taken within Red Pines was a step closer to a collapse, a breaking point beyond which nothing would remain recognizable. The asylum's pulse quickened, synchronized with Elias's presence. Staff whispered that the final hour was near, that the building itself awaited a signal, something only Elias could give, to unleash the darkness hidden beneath its walls. As the line between the known and the unknown thinned, the question remained: who, or what, would survive when the asylum finally opened its doors and let the nightmare spill out into the world? The very air inside Red Pines grew heavier with each passing day, as if the building inhaled despair and exhaled dread. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, as though alive, their surfaces rippling like skin over something massive and hidden beneath. The familiar became strange, and the strange became unbearable. Time fractured, folding upon itself, and the asylum existed in a liminal space between reality and something far more sinister. Those who remained found themselves haunted not only by the whispers and shadows but by memories that weren't theirs. Faces of patients long gone flashed before their eyes, accompanied by fragmented voices calling for release or revenge. Some saw themselves reflected in mirrors, but distorted, twisted versions that moved independently, their mouths forming words no one else could hear. The staff began to keep careful logs, desperately trying to document what was happening, but even writing became unreliable. Ink would smear, pages would tear themselves, and entries vanished as if erased by unseen hands. Technology failed in inexplicable ways, recorders captured only static, cameras showed blurred, shifting figures, computers crashed without cause. Attempts to communicate beyond the asylum were thwarted, phone lines dead or filled with incoherent screams. Amid this chaos, the name Elias loomed larger than ever. The presence felt less like a ghost and more like a force of nature, unstoppable, indifferent, consuming everything it touched. The few who dared to speak openly about Elias described a being beyond human understanding, a predator cloaked in the guise of a man, a guardian of the asylum's dark secret. His eyes were said to hold the void itself, pulling all who met his gaze into eternal darkness. The asylum's layout itself began to shift wildly. Hallways that once connected familiar rooms now led to endless staircases descending into darkness or looping back impossibly to their starting points. Rooms appeared and disappeared overnight, replaced by voids filled with cold silence. It was as if the building was a living labyrinth, reshaping itself in tune with Elias's will. One particularly chilling development was the appearance of symbols carved into walls and floors, strange runes glowing faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. No one could decipher their meaning, but the patterns resembled spirals, eyes, and grasping hands. Staff reported feeling watched whenever near these marks, a sensation of being scrutinized by something ancient and malevolent. Patients who had once been catatonic or incoherent now spoke in strange tongues or chanted words that sent chills down the spines of listeners. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the asylum's growing corruption. Attempts to calm or restrain them were futile, as if their bodies were no longer entirely their own, controlled instead by Elias's unseen hand. Amid the growing madness, small pockets of resistance emerged. A handful of staff tried to maintain order, to protect those still clinging to sanity. They formed secret meetings, sharing fragments of knowledge and plans to escape the asylum's ever-tightening grip. But these efforts were often crushed by the asylum's shifting nature, or by the inexplicable disappearances of those involved. Some believed the key to breaking Elias's hold lay in the asylum's past, the dark rituals, the sacrifices performed beneath its foundations, and the mysterious figure who had been the first patient to disappear without a trace. Legends told of a ritual that could seal Elias away, but the knowledge was fragmented and dangerous. The materials required were rare and scattered, and the risk of failure was immense. As desperation mounted, fear transformed into something darker, hopelessness. The building itself seemed to feed on despair, growing stronger as its inhabitants succumbed to madness. Shadows lengthened into monstrous shapes, and the walls whispered promises of oblivion. Nightmares spilled into waking hours, and even the most rational minds began to doubt their own perceptions. Among the few who dared to confront Elias directly, none returned unchanged. One security officer reported a chilling encounter deep within the asylum's bowels, where he claimed to have seen Elias's true form, a shifting mass of shadows and broken reflections that spoke in a voice like shattered glass. The officer's final words were a warning: "It's not a man. It's the darkness itself, and it's hungry." In the midst of this growing terror, the asylum's exterior began to show signs of decay. Windows shattered spontaneously, vines crept over crumbling walls, and the ground around the building cracked as if the earth itself was trying to swallow the place whole. Local wildlife fled in droves, leaving a dead zone of silence and stillness. The community around Red Pines, once dismissive or fearful, began to mobilize. Rumors and tales sparked a surge of urban legends, attracting thrill-seekers and investigators alike. But none who entered returned whole. Some were found wandering in shock, others vanished without a trace. The asylum was becoming a magnet for tragedy, a black hole pulling in all who dared approach. Yet Elias remained patient, biding his time. The presence grew stronger, its tendrils weaving through the building and minds alike. It was no longer just a haunting, it was an invasion. The asylum was a fortress built to contain something ancient and malevolent, but that containment was failing. In the end, there was only one certainty: Red Pines was alive, and it was waiting. Waiting for the moment when the boundary between worlds would break, and Elias's hunger would be unleashed upon the world outside. The last patients were no longer human, just vessels, shadows, echoes trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. The question wasn't if the darkness would spread, but when. The air inside Red Pines thickened, oppressive and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on every chest. It was no longer just a place of confinement, it had become a crucible of dread, where hope and reason melted into shadow. The asylum's walls, once plain and cold, now seemed almost organic, breathing in slow, painful rhythms that echoed through the empty halls. The building itself had become a predator, and everyone trapped inside was its prey. Elias's presence had grown beyond simple haunting, it was a force twisting the very fabric of the asylum's reality. Light bent strangely around corners, shadows lingered where none should be, and sound warped into distorted echoes that replayed like broken memories. Time unraveled, seconds stretching into eternities and collapsing without warning, leaving those inside disoriented and trapped in a waking nightmare. The few staff members still functional whispered of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, walls bleeding dark stains, and untraceable footsteps pacing the floors. Patient screams pierced the silence, but often no one was found when help arrived. The building seemed to swallow voices, trapping them in a labyrinthine void between rooms and memories. Inside this chaos, Elias was more than a name, he was a presence that invaded minds and dreams. Those who glimpsed him described eyes like black holes, swallowing light and sanity alike, and a smile that twisted into something grotesque and malevolent. His voice echoed in the minds of the desperate, promising release from torment but delivering only eternal captivity. Rumors spread among the remaining patients that Elias was a guardian of a door, a gateway to something beyond human understanding. Some believed the asylum was built over this gateway, a prison designed to contain what lurked beneath. Others whispered that Elias was both warden and prisoner, bound to the asylum by forces far older than anyone alive. Attempts to communicate with the outside world became futile. Phones rang endlessly with static, radios emitted bursts of incoherent noise, and even written messages disappeared as if erased by unseen hands. Those who tried to escape found themselves lost in endless hallways that twisted back on themselves or opened into voids of absolute darkness. Patients changed in alarming ways. Once mute individuals spoke in tongues unknown to any living language, eyes glowing faintly as if lit by an inner fire. Others convulsed, their bodies contorting into unnatural shapes as if puppeted by Elias's unseen strings. The asylum seemed to feed on their fear and pain, growing stronger with each shattered mind. The journal of the vanished caretaker became a grim guide for those who dared to study Elias's nature. It spoke of rituals performed in the asylum's deepest catacombs, blood rites meant to bind or banish the darkness, ceremonies that had failed again and again. The final pages hinted at a desperate plan, a sacrifice powerful enough to seal the gateway, but at a terrible cost. Hope dwindled as more succumbed to the asylum's corruption. Some staff members locked themselves away in sealed rooms, clutching talismans or ancient texts, trying to hold back the encroaching darkness. Others disappeared without trace, their last cries swallowed by the asylum's insatiable hunger. Outside, the town around Red Pines whispered warnings but dared not intervene. Legends of the asylum's curse spread like wildfire, fueled by strange disappearances and terrifying sightings near the forest's edge. The area around the asylum became a dead zone, where animals fled and the trees seemed twisted and unnatural, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. Inside, the asylum's physical structure defied logic. Floors shifted, staircases appeared where none had been before, and rooms morphed or vanished altogether. The building itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap and confuse, ensuring that none could find a true way out. In this shifting maze, Elias reigned supreme, a dark king of shadows and fear. He appeared unpredictably, sometimes a fleeting silhouette in a flickering light, other times a towering figure blocking corridors with eyes that burned with cold fire. His voice whispered promises and threats, seeping into the minds of the vulnerable, pulling them deeper into madness. The few who resisted found themselves isolated, hunted by the shadows that now filled every corner. The asylum's walls bled despair, and even the strongest wills began to fracture. Sleep became impossible, dreams twisted into nightmares so vivid they bled into waking moments. Reality and hallucination merged until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Some believed the final act was near, a reckoning when Elias would tear open the gateway and unleash whatever dark force waited beyond. Others feared that the asylum itself would collapse into the void it contained, taking everyone inside with it. The question lingered: who would survive, and what would remain of their souls? The darkness had become a living thing, and it was hungry. Elias was its herald and its prisoner, bound by chains forged in ancient blood. The asylum was no longer just a building, it was a tomb, a cage, and a battleground for forces beyond comprehension. Every heartbeat echoed the same chilling truth: the nightmare was far from over. The last patient was not alone, and the shadows were watching, waiting for the moment to claim their final prey. The asylum no longer followed the rules of the natural world. Walls bled, floors creaked under unseen weight, and an unnatural chill permeated the air, seeping deep into bones and souls. The presence of Elias wasn't just felt, it controlled everything, a puppeteer pulling invisible strings in a grand design of terror and despair. Each heartbeat inside Red Pine synchronized with an ever-deepening darkness, as if the building itself was breathing in unison with the malignant force within. Those who remained found their senses betraying them. Sounds became distorted, footsteps echoed in empty corridors, whispers drifted from nowhere and everywhere at once. Eyes played cruel tricks, reflecting images that weren't there or showing faces twisted into grotesque masks of pain. The boundary between hallucination and reality dissolved, leaving only confusion and fear. Every attempt to leave the asylum was met with cruel futility. Hallways looped endlessly, doors vanished or led to places unimaginable. One moment, a patient would be in a familiar room, the next, in a space that stretched infinitely or closed in like a suffocating cage. The very architecture was alive, reshaping itself to trap, torment, and break minds. Elias moved like a shadow slipping between these warped spaces, always just beyond sight. Sometimes, the air would ripple with his presence before he appeared, sending a cold wave through the body and chilling the soul. His eyes, described by those who glimpsed them, were voids that swallowed light and hope. His smile was a fracture in the world, a cruel promise of the oblivion he wielded. The patients, once desperate and frightened, now sometimes seemed to serve him willingly. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and their voices carried the rhythm of chants, words lost to human tongues but resonating with ancient power. Some moved in unnerving unison, their bodies contorting in impossible ways, as if puppets dancing to Elias's unseen tune. Staff members who remained fought a losing battle against the overwhelming despair. Their minds frayed under the weight of constant terror and isolation. They sought refuge in forgotten rooms, clutching talismans or reciting prayers, but such efforts felt like whispers against a hurricane. Letters and journals chronicled the slow descent into madness, but even these were sometimes consumed by an unseen force, leaving behind only smudged ink and shredded pages. The asylum's history clawed back from the depths of time, revealing dark rituals and sacrifices buried beneath the foundation. These ancient rites had been attempts to seal away what lay beneath the asylum, to bind Elias and the darkness he guarded. But the seals weakened with each passing year, and the rituals had been incomplete or corrupted. The legacy of blood and sorrow was written into every stone of the building. Outside, the world beyond red pines trembled with unease. The forest surrounding the asylum grew twisted and silent, animals fleeing or vanishing without trace. The locals spoke in hushed tones of a curse, warning all to stay far away. Sightings of strange lights and heartrending cries from the asylum filled the night, but no one dared to investigate. Within the asylum, the very air felt charged with malevolence. A creeping rot spread beneath the floors, a darkness that gnawed at reality itself. Shadows took on a life of their own, stretching and twisting into forms that defied description. The building exhaled a cold breath that whispered secrets no human was meant to hear. A few brave souls sought answers in the asylum's forbidden places, catacombs, sealed rooms, and forgotten archives filled with dusty tomes and cryptic symbols. They pieced together the fragments of a ritual, one last chance to banish the darkness, but it demanded a sacrifice beyond imagining. The price was not just blood, but something far deeper, the surrender of the self, a soul bound eternally to the shadows. The asylum's time was running out. The forces within it stirred, preparing for a reckoning that would shake the thin veil separating worlds. Elias, no longer confined by human limitations, sought freedom, and the asylum would be the gateway. As the last embers of hope flickered, the question haunted every remaining mind: who would be left standing when the shadows claimed their due? And when the gates finally broke open, what horrors would spill forth into the world beyond? The walls whispered secrets now, not in words but in echoes of forgotten pain and fractured memories. Time itself seemed fractured inside red pines, folding back upon itself in impossible loops. Days bled into nights without distinction, and the remaining souls found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair. Elias's influence had infected everything: minds, bodies, even the very air breathed in. Those who had once resisted the madness now found themselves drawn into a strange trance, compelled to walk the halls with vacant eyes and hollow hearts. Their footsteps were slow, as if pulled by an invisible force, guided by the dark will that dominated the asylum. Conversations became fractured and disjointed, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of fear and submission. The building itself responded to this rising tide of despair. Floors shifted beneath feet, walls breathed in rhythm with a terrible heartbeat, and windows revealed glimpses of other worlds, twisted landscapes filled with nightmarish shapes and endless darkness. Escape was a cruel illusion, a promise made only to be shattered by the cruel geometry of the asylum's ever-changing layout. Elias was no longer just a ghost or a spirit, he was the asylum incarnate. His form flickered at the edge of vision, sometimes a shadow, sometimes a towering figure wreathed in smoke and cold flame. His eyes burned with a terrible light, a void that devoured hope and sanity alike. His smile was a jagged scar across the face of reality, promising ruin to any who dared to meet it. The patients who once feared him now worshipped him as a dark god. Their chants echoed through the halls, words ancient and incomprehensible, calling forth powers no living mind should comprehend. Some moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if their bodies were no longer their own, mere vessels for something far older and far crueler. Staff members, worn thin by sleepless nights and endless horrors, clung to fading memories of who they once were. Some tried desperately to document the unraveling, filling journals with accounts of impossible events, but even these records often twisted into nonsense, as if corrupted by Elias's presence. Others vanished without a trace, swallowed by the asylum's growing darkness. Deep beneath red pines, the catacombs pulsed with an otherworldly energy. Ancient symbols carved into stone glowed faintly, resonating with the evil trapped below. Here, the rituals of old had been attempted, sacrifices made, blood spilled, all in vain. The darkness was patient, eternal, waiting for the moment it could rise and consume everything. The local stories grew more desperate. Fires were set to keep the shadows at bay, but even the flames seemed weak against the cold, suffocating fog that seeped from the asylum's walls. Those who ventured too close spoke of whispers carried on the wind, voices pleading for release or warning of doom. Animals disappeared, their absence a silent testament to the growing evil. Inside, the last few souls faced a grim reality: survival meant embracing the darkness or being consumed by it. Fear twisted into a perverse form of loyalty. Some offered themselves willingly, seeing in Elias a twisted salvation from their torment. Others resisted, their minds fracturing as the shadows closed in, until only madness remained. The final ritual remained a secret whispered among the few who dared speak of it, a desperate gamble to seal the gateway forever, but at the cost of a soul pure enough to contain the darkness. No one knew if such a sacrifice was possible or if it would only unleash something far worse. Elias's power grew with every passing moment. The asylum became a living nightmare, a place where reality bent and shattered, and the line between life and death blurred. The darkness was patient, and its hunger was endless. Every heartbeat echoed with the knowledge that the end was near, that the last patient, the final soul trapped within red pines, held a fate intertwined with the asylum's own survival or destruction. The air grew heavier with each passing hour, thickening like a suffocating fog that seeped into lungs and minds alike. The walls seemed to pulse with a slow, malevolent rhythm, a heartbeat not of flesh and blood, but of shadow and decay. Time unraveled completely within red pines, clocks spun wildly, their hands twisting in impossible directions, and the sun outside became a distant, forgotten memory. Those trapped inside had long since lost any sense of reality, drifting deeper into a nightmare that stretched without end. Elias's presence had grown undeniable, a force that seeped into every corner of the asylum's twisted corridors. His power radiated like a dark sun, warping the very fabric of the building and those who inhabited it. The last patients, hollowed and broken, moved like ghosts, their eyes glassy pools reflecting the void. Some whispered his name as a prayer, others screamed it in terror, but all were caught in his web. The asylum's structure itself had become a living prison. Walls folded and unfolded, corridors lengthened and shortened, doors vanished or led into impossibilities. No one could trust their own footsteps, a path that led to safety one moment became a dead end the next. Shadows clung like cobwebs, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to watch with malicious intent. Elias was the master of this nightmare realm, slipping through the shifting shadows like a wraith. His form was never fully visible, a flicker here, a dark silhouette there, but his influence was felt in the cold that chilled to the bone, the whispering voices that clawed at sanity, and the oppressive sense of dread that blanketed every inch of the asylum. His eyes, said to burn with an unnatural light, were the windows to a void that consumed hope and reason. The remaining few who resisted found their minds fracturing under the relentless pressure. Hallucinations blurred the line between friend and foe. Familiar faces twisted into monsters, memories distorted into sinister lies. Some reached out for one another, desperate for connection, only to be betrayed by shadows that mimicked their voices or gestures. Trust became a weapon turned inward, unraveling what little sanity remained. The dark rituals buried beneath the asylum's foundation whispered through the stones like a curse. Symbols etched in blood and bone glowed faintly in hidden chambers, pulsing with a dreadful energy. These ancient rites had once been intended to imprison the darkness, but centuries of neglect and corruption had turned the seals into conduits. The asylum was no longer a sanctuary, it was a beacon, calling to something ancient and hungry beyond the veil of reality. Outside, the forest surrounding red pines rotted under an unnatural pall. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Wildlife vanished, and an eerie silence replaced the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures. The air carried a faint, metallic scent, like blood and rust, that clung to the skin and lingered long after leaving the area. Rumors among the locals grew darker, more desperate. Some claimed to see lights flickering in the windows late at night, hear the screams of the damned carried on the wind, or glimpse shadowy figures lurking just beyond the tree line. Attempts to investigate ended in madness or disappearance. Red Pines had become a place whispered about only in fearful tones, a place to be avoided at all costs. Within the asylum, a faint glimmer of resistance persisted. A handful of patients and staff, those whose minds had not completely shattered, sought to find a way to end the nightmare. Scouring ancient texts and forgotten journals, they pieced together fragments of a ritual, a final desperate act that might seal the darkness away once more. But the price was steep, a sacrifice beyond blood or flesh. It demanded the surrender of one's very soul, binding it eternally to the shadow in exchange for sealing the gateway. Fear and resolve intertwined in these final moments. Some volunteered willingly, seeing in this sacrifice a twisted hope for redemption. Others balked, paralyzed by the terror of the unknown fate that awaited them. The asylum held its breath, waiting for the inevitable choice, the final reckoning. Elias, aware of the stirring opposition, became more relentless. The shadows deepened, becoming thicker and more suffocating. His whispers echoed in the minds of the remaining souls, promises of power, release, or oblivion. His presence was a storm gathering, poised to break the fragile barrier between worlds. The very fabric of red pines trembled as the moment drew near. The last patient, the final link in the asylum's chain, stood on the precipice of a choice that would determine the fate of all trapped within. To embrace the darkness and become its eternal guardian, or to sacrifice themselves to banish the horror, forever lost, but perhaps saving countless others from the same fate. Outside, the wind howled like a mournful dirge, carrying the faintest echo of a cry, human, animal, or something else entirely, fading into the distance. The asylum waited in silence, a tomb of forgotten souls and unspoken horrors, on the edge of oblivion. The final patient's mind was a battleground where fading memories clashed with the relentless pressure of darkness pressing in from every side. Faces from a forgotten past flickered like broken photographs, moments of warmth swallowed by an ever-encroaching void. The last fragments of hope were slipping away, dissolving into the abyss that had claimed so many before. Yet beneath the despair, a fragile ember remained, a quiet refusal to surrender completely. Within the twisting halls, that ember struggled against the suffocating weight of Elias's presence. The Shadow Lord's influence had seeped into every crack, every broken tile, twisting the building into a labyrinth of torment and madness. But the ember flickered still, a faint pulse in the endless night. It was the spark of resistance, the final breath of humanity clinging to existence. Whispers of the ritual grew louder in the patient's mind, like a distant chant weaving through the shadows. The knowledge was both a curse and a salvation, a promise that the nightmare could end, but only through a sacrifice so profound it defied understanding. The soul must be offered willingly, bound forever to the darkness, a living seal that could hold the ancient evil at bay. The weight of that choice was crushing, yet no other path remained. Elias's shadow shifted closer, a cold presence felt rather than seen. It seeped into the patient's skin like ice, chilling every nerve and stilling the heartbeat. The darkness promised power, release from pain, the end of suffering, seductive lies wrapped in a velvet shroud. It whispered of becoming more than flesh, transcending mortal limits, and ruling over the abyss. But beneath the tempting words lurked the truth: surrender meant eternal imprisonment, a soul lost forever to the void. The asylum groaned as if alive, its walls tightening like a noose. The labyrinth of corridors twisted tighter, closing in around the last patient, guiding them toward the ancient chamber deep beneath the building where the ritual would be performed. The air grew thick with the scent of old blood and decay, the oppressive energy crackling like static in the skin. Every step echoed with the weight of centuries, the burden of countless souls trapped in this place of endless torment. Memories surged unbidden, flashes of life before the asylum, laughter that now seemed impossible, a touch of sunlight on skin long faded into shadow. The patient reached deep into those fading fragments, grasping for something solid to hold against the swirling chaos. The ember flickered brighter, a beacon in the gathering dark. Voices rose in the distance chanting low and steady, the ancient words that bound the darkness whispered with trembling reverence. The last patient stepped into the chamber, surrounded by symbols etched in bone and blood, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The air shimmered with power, the threshold between worlds thinning until it was nearly transparent. Elias waited in the shadows, his form a shifting mass of smoke and flame. His eyes burned like coals, watching with hunger and anticipation. The last patient felt the pull, the irresistible tug toward surrender, but also the fragile hope that this sacrifice could end the nightmare. To give everything, even one's soul, to save what little remained of humanity. The ritual began, a dance of shadow and light. The patient's voice joined the ancient chant, trembling but unwavering. The words wove a tapestry of power, binding and banishing, a desperate plea cast into the void. The wall seemed to breathe, the ground pulsed, and the air thrummed with energy beyond comprehension. Pain blossomed like a black rose, sharp and unrelenting, as the soul was drawn from its fragile vessel and offered as the seal. The darkness screamed in fury and hunger, but the ancient bonds held fast, tightening like chains forged in fire. Light and shadow clashed in a final, terrible battle, invisible to mortal eyes, yet echoing in the very fabric of existence. When the last word was spoken, silence fell. The oppressive weight lifted, the labyrinth shifted back into a semblance of order, and the oppressive cold began to thaw. The darkness was sealed, its gateway closed by a sacrifice that echoed through time. But the cost was absolute. The last patient's form dissolved into shadow, becoming part of the eternal prison. Their essence lingered only as a faint flicker, a whisper lost in the vast void. The ember of resistance had burned bright one final time, but now it was extinguished, leaving only a solemn peace. Outside Red Pines, the forest remained silent but less hostile. The air seemed lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The nightmare was over, for now. But the asylum's walls held their secrets close, waiting patiently for the day when the darkness might stir again. The last patient sacrifice was a beacon of hope and warning, a testament to the fragile line between light and shadow, and the price paid to keep the abyss at bay. The echoes of that night would haunt the asylum forever, a reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some darkness is never truly defeated. The night after the ritual was unlike any before. A profound stillness settled over Red Pines, so complete it seemed to absorb even sound itself. The oppressive weight that had haunted the asylum lifted, leaving behind an eerie calm. The corridors no longer twisted and pulsed with malicious intent. The shadows retreated into the corners, no longer reaching out like grasping fingers. For the first time in decades, the asylum seemed still, as if holding its breath. But the silence was deceptive. Beneath the quiet surface, the building's ancient heart still throbbed. The darkness, though sealed, was not destroyed. It lay dormant, a coiled serpent waiting for a careless moment to strike again. The blood-etched symbols that had once glowed with sinister light were now faint, but never gone. They whispered warnings in forgotten tongues, warnings ignored by those who had fled or been consumed. The few staff members who remained found themselves haunted by memories that were not their own. Dreams invaded their sleep, visions of cold stone chambers, of shadows writhing beneath flickering candlelight, and of the last patient's sacrifice. Some awoke in sweat, their hearts pounding with a terror that clung to them like a second skin. Others found strange marks on their skin, symbols etched faintly as if burned into flesh, a lingering connection to the ritual. Outside the asylum, the world continued unaware of the horrors that had transpired. Trees swayed in the gentle wind, the moon cast silver light over still waters, and distant lights twinkled in quiet towns. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, a subtle shift had taken place. The balance between worlds had been altered, and the veil between the living and the dead was thinner than ever. Rumors circulated quietly among locals. Whispers of lights flickering behind boarded windows, of shadows glimpsed just beyond vision, and of faint cries carried on the wind. Few dared approach the asylum now, the few who did never stayed long. Some returned changed, pale, hollow-eyed, as if a part of their soul had been left behind in the darkness. The patient who had sacrificed everything was gone from the living world, but their presence lingered in ways both subtle and profound. Echoes of their final moments seemed to ripple through the asylum's walls, a sigh in the silence, a flicker of movement at the edge of vision, a whisper of hope and warning. They had become part of the very fabric of Red Pines, a guardian spirit bound to the shadows. Despite the seeming peace, the asylum's history could not be erased. The horrors, the madness, the lives lost and broken within its walls remained a stain on the land. Red Pines was a place where the past bled into the present, where memories of pain and suffering seeped into the soil like poison. The earth around it was barren, the forest twisted and gnarled as if scarred by unseen claws. Occasionally, new souls arrived, drawn by curiosity or desperation, only to vanish without a trace. Sometimes their belongings were found outside the gates, abandoned and scattered as if dropped in terror. Those few who escaped told stories that made even the bravest shudder, voices that called from the darkness, footsteps behind them in empty halls, and the unshakable feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The ritual had not closed the book on Red Pines, it had only turned a page. The asylum waited patiently, its secrets buried but never gone. Shadows lurked in every corner, waiting for the day when the boundaries would blur again. The last patient's sacrifice was a fragile seal, a momentary reprieve in an ancient war that had raged far longer than human memory. Time passed differently in this place, stretched and warped by the lingering darkness. Visitors who entered one day sometimes found themselves outside years later, or never at all. The asylum defied logic, slipping in and out of reality like a ghostly mirage. Those who tried to map its halls found their efforts futile, corridors shifted, rooms vanished, and new passages appeared without explanation. Yet amidst this chaos, a strange beauty persisted. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the first light brushed the horizon, Red Pine seemed almost peaceful. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and earth, and the distant call of a lone bird pierced the silence. It was a fleeting glimpse of normalcy, a reminder that even in darkness, light could still find a way to shine. But the light was fragile, and the darkness patient. It waited for the cracks to widen, for the ember of sacrifice to flicker and fade. When that happened, the shadows would surge once more, reclaiming what was lost and dragging the asylum back into the abyss. For now, the story of Red Pines was one of endings and beginnings, a tale of sacrifice, despair, and the fragile hope that even the darkest night must end. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was a warning. The last patient's voice, barely more than a whisper on the wind, carried a final message: beware the shadows that sleep. For when they wake, no soul is safe. The passage of months after the ritual was marked by an unsettling quiet, but beneath the surface, the asylum's old wounds were far from healed. The seal that had been cast was fragile, more a delicate thread than an unbreakable bond. The darkness that once consumed Red Pines had retreated, but it lingered like a ghost at the edge of perception, waiting for the moment to unravel. The staff who remained spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences, whispers in empty hallways, flickering lights that defied explanation, and shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. Objects shifted inexplicably, doors closed without touch, and cold spots chilled the air despite the warmth of summer. The building was alive in a way no one could fully understand, as if the very walls remembered the pain and terror they had witnessed. In the deeper levels, where the ritual had been performed, a faint glow pulsed beneath the cracked tiles, a heartbeat that echoed faintly in the silence. The symbols etched in bone and blood remained faintly luminous, their power waning but persistent. The last patient's sacrifice had sealed the darkness, but it had also tethered their essence to the place, binding them in eternal vigil. Outside the asylum, the forest grew denser, the trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The earth was damp and cold, and the air thick with the scent of decay. Locals avoided the area, whispering warnings of strange lights and unexplainable sounds after dark. Some spoke of figures glimpsed among the trees, pale faces with hollow eyes watching silently from the shadows. Those who dared enter the asylum spoke of an overwhelming sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes followed every step. The air seemed heavier, filled with a weight that pressed down on the chest and muddled the mind. Time itself seemed distorted, moments stretching into eternity or snapping by in an instant. Visitors found themselves lost in the labyrinthine halls, unable to retrace their steps, trapped in a shifting maze that defied logic. The last patient's spirit lingered somewhere within the asylum's depths, a presence that was both guardian and prisoner. Their sacrifice had bought time, but it came with a terrible price. Bound to the shadows, they were forced to watch as the darkness waited patiently, biding its time. The ember of resistance that had burned so brightly was now a flickering flame, fragile and uncertain. Rumors began to spread of a new presence within the asylum, a shadow among shadows, darker and colder than anything before. Some claimed it was Elias himself, the ancient evil never fully defeated, returning to reclaim his domain. Others whispered of a curse born from the ritual, a lingering malevolence that fed on fear and despair. Whatever it was growing stronger, feeding on the weakening seal and the cracks in the fabric of reality. The staff grew fearful, their dreams plagued by visions of endless darkness and screaming faces. Some resigned themselves to the asylum's fate, while others clung desperately to hope, searching for a way to reinforce the bond or banish the darkness once and for all. But each attempt to intervene only seemed to strengthen the shadows, as if they fed on the struggle itself. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the war waging in the forgotten corners of Red Pines. Life continued its indifferent march, seasons changed, people were born and died, and the night stretched on, endless and unyielding. But beneath the surface, the boundary between worlds thinned, and the asylum waited. The last patient's sacrifice was a story whispered in the wind, a cautionary tale of courage and despair. It was a reminder that some darkness could never be fully defeated, only held at bay. The shadows that had been locked away were patient, eternal, and hungry. The ritual had not closed the chapter, it had opened a new one. The story of Red Pines was far from over. The silence that followed was not peace but a breath held, a moment of fragile balance before the storm. The ember of hope flickered still, but the darkness waited for its moment. When that moment came, it would consume everything. The days blurred into nights, and the nights into endless shadows. The asylum, once a place of cold stone and rusted bars, had transformed into something altogether more sinister. The air hung thick with a tension that no one could explain, a weight pressing down on every breath. The balance between light and darkness had shifted, tilting ever so slightly toward the abyss. The few who remained inside the asylum spoke of an invisible presence that prowled the halls. It was a hunger without form, an unrelenting force that devoured hope and sanity alike. Those who heard its whisper were said to lose themselves, their minds unraveling like threads pulled too tight. The voices in the walls grew louder, chanting in languages long forgotten, their cadence a dirge for the lost. The forest surrounding Red Pine seemed to pulse with life in the darkness. Trees groaned and creaked as though awakening from a long slumber, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that reached hungrily toward the asylum. The ground beneath was soft and cold, as if soaked in decades of sorrow and fear. Those who walked near at night spoke of flickers of pale light weaving between the trunks, and eyes that glowed with unnatural hunger. Inside the asylum, time had lost its meaning. Days could pass in an instant, or drag on endlessly like a waking nightmare. The halls shifted like a living labyrinth, corridors bending and twisting until they no longer resembled the architecture of men. Doors led to nowhere, staircases spiraled into the void, and rooms appeared and vanished like memories on the edge of recall. The last patient's sacrifice lingered like a fragile thread holding the darkness at bay, but it was fraying. The ancient evil that had been locked away was stirring, its presence felt in the cold spots that appeared without warning, and the shadows that flickered at the edge of vision. The blood-stained symbols carved during the ritual pulsed weakly, a faint heartbeat echoing through the stones. Staff and visitors alike found themselves caught in a slow descent into madness. Hallucinations came unbidden, faces melting into the walls, hands reaching from the floor, and voices calling from the shadows. Some disappeared without trace, their screams swallowed by the night. Others returned hollow-eyed and broken, speaking in riddles and gibberish, haunted by visions of a man who was both everywhere and nowhere. Outside the asylum, the world remained indifferent. Townsfolk went about their lives, unaware that a storm was gathering at their doorstep. Strange lights were seen in the sky above the asylum on clear nights, swirling orbs of fire and ice dancing in a silent symphony. Animals fled the forest, their instincts warning them of the darkness that seeped into the land. In the deepest parts of Red Pines, the last patient's presence flickered like a dying flame. Bound to the shadows, neither fully alive nor dead, they struggled to maintain the fragile boundary between this world and the next. The sacrifice had cost them everything, but their will endured, a beacon in the encroaching night. Whispers told of a figure moving through the asylum's endless halls, silent, unseen, but always watching. Some believed it was the last patient's spirit, trapped between worlds, trying to protect what remained. Others whispered darker rumors, that the ancient evil had taken on a new form, wearing the mask of salvation to lure the living into its embrace. The boundary between reality and nightmare grew thin. Those who ventured too close felt the pull of the darkness, a siren's call that promised release from pain and fear. The asylum itself seemed to breathe, its walls pulsing with a heartbeat that was not human. Every shadow held a secret, every corner a threat. And yet, despite the terror, some clung to hope. They searched for answers in the ruins of the past, hoping to find a way to strengthen the seal and banish the darkness once and for all. But each discovery came with a cost, uncovering truths better left buried. The story of Red Pines was no longer just about the asylum or its patients. It had become a tale of two worlds intertwined, one of life, and one of shadows. The last patient's sacrifice had delayed the inevitable, but it could not stop it forever. The darkness was patient. It waited in the silence, watching for the moment when the fragile thread would break. When that moment came, the shadows would rise again, and the nightmare would begin anew. The oppressive silence that had settled over Red Pines was broken only by the faintest sounds, the creak of old wood, the distant drip of water, and the whisper of the wind threading through broken windows. Each noise seemed magnified, a reminder that something was watching, waiting in the shadows. The balance between light and darkness continued to erode, with every passing day tipping the scales further toward the abyss. The air inside the asylum grew colder, carrying a scent that no one could place, something metallic, like dried blood mixed with the rust of forgotten memories. The few remaining staff spoke in hushed voices, their faces drawn and haunted. They told of footsteps that followed them down empty corridors, doors that slammed shut without warning, and fleeting glimpses of figures vanishing just out of reach. The forest around Red Pines had become a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadowed paths. Locals who once dared to explore its edges no longer spoke of it. Superstitions grew thick, whispered warnings passed between neighbors about strange lights and eerie cries that pierced the night. Some swore they had seen pale figures wandering beneath the gnarled branches, lost souls drawn to the asylum's lingering darkness. Inside the crumbling walls, time seemed fractured. Moments stretched and snapped unpredictably, as if the asylum existed outside of normal reality. Days and nights blurred together, and those trapped inside found themselves disoriented, lost in an ever-shifting maze. Rooms appeared and disappeared, corridors twisted back on themselves, and the building seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The blood-stained ritual that had sealed the darkness remained faintly visible beneath the dust and grime. Its glow pulsed weakly, like a dying ember struggling to keep the night at bay. But even that fragile barrier was weakening. Cracks appeared in the seal, unseen by most, but felt by all who dared to linger near the heart of the asylum. The last patient's presence lingered as well, an ethereal figure caught between worlds, bound by a sacrifice that had cost them everything. Their spirit was both protector and prisoner, watching the slow decay of the asylum and the resurgence of ancient evil. The strength of their will kept the darkness contained, but it was a battle fought with dwindling resources. Those who had witnessed the last patient's sacrifice often spoke of a calm in their eyes, a fierce determination that defied death itself. Yet beneath that resolve lay a deep exhaustion, as if the struggle had drained not only their body but their very soul. Their sacrifice was a beacon, but even beacons flicker when the night grows too long. The ancient evil, long thought defeated, stirred beneath the surface. It fed on fear, despair, and the fractures in reality. Its influence crept into dreams and waking thoughts alike, twisting perceptions and sowing madness. The whispers in the walls grew louder, chanting in a tongue that scratched at the edges of sanity. The asylum itself was becoming a crucible of darkness. Every shadow, every cracked tile, every peeling wall seemed to pulse with malevolence. The building was no longer just a structure, it was a living entity, an extension of the darkness it contained. It waited patiently, knowing that all barriers eventually fall. Outside, the world continued unaware. The townsfolk went about their daily lives, oblivious to the gathering storm. But the signs were there for those who dared to look, the strange lights in the sky, the animals fleeing the forest, and the chilling silence that blanketed the asylum's grounds. A sense of inevitability hung heavy in the air. The last patient's sacrifice had delayed the darkness, but it could not stop it forever. The seal weakened, and the shadows grew bolder, probing the boundaries between worlds. The line that separated reality from nightmare thinned, threatening to break. And in that moment of fragile balance, the asylum awaited its fate. The darkness was patient, eternal, and hungry. It knew that all things must end. The ember of resistance was flickering low, and the night was ready to reclaim what was once lost. When the shadows rose again, there would be no turning back. The walls of red pine seemed to pulse with a dark rhythm, as if the asylum itself had become a beating heart of something monstrous. The shadows deepened, swallowing more of the weak light that tried to cling to the broken windows. Every corner, every hallway whispered of things long buried, secrets too terrible to speak aloud, and evils that waited patiently beneath the surface. The last patient's sacrifice was a fading memory in the minds of most, but not forgotten by the darkness. It had left a scar across the building, a wound in reality where the veil between this world and something far darker was paper-thin. The air vibrated with a strange energy, one that unsettled even the most hardened souls still trapped within the asylum's crumbling walls. The staff who remained were shadows of their former selves. Each carried the weight of unseen horrors, their eyes hollow and their hands trembling. They spoke less, moved slower, as if the very fabric of their sanity was unraveling thread by thread. Some vanished overnight, leaving behind only the faintest echo of a scream and a chilling cold that lingered long after their absence. The forest surrounding red pines had grown wild and tangled, as if nature itself was trying to push back against the darkness that had seeped out from the asylum's depths. The trees bent and twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. Locals avoided the area altogether, whispering of a cursed place where the air tasted of despair and the ground seemed soaked with forgotten blood. Inside, the building's shifting architecture grew more pronounced. Staircases spiraled into endless darkness, doors opened onto walls, and hallways looped back on themselves, disorienting anyone who dared to navigate the asylum's ever-changing maze. The building was no longer a place designed by human hands but had become a living nightmare, a trap designed to consume souls one by one. The faint glow of the blood-stained seal still lingered in the deepest chamber, but it flickered weakly, like a candle struggling against a rising wind. The ancient evil pressed against it, relentless and patient. It whispered promises of power, freedom, and escape from pain, seductive lies meant to lure the desperate and broken into its grasp. The last patient spirit, tethered to the seal by their sacrifice, fought a losing battle. Their presence flickered like a dying star, a fragile barrier holding back a tide that threatened to engulf everything. They had become both guardian and prisoner, trapped between worlds, their souls stretched thin by the weight of their eternal duty. Voices echoed through the asylum's halls, some pleading, others threatening. The air was thick with tension, and unseen eyes watched every movement. Madness crept closer, an invisible fog that clouded minds and warped perceptions. Dreams became nightmares, and waking life blurred into hallucination. The darkness was no longer content to remain hidden. It reached out through cracks in reality, manifesting as fleeting shadows, cold spots, and whispers just beyond comprehension. Some claimed to see figures lurking at the edges of vision, pale, silent, and watching with eyes that held nothing but hunger. Outside the asylum, the world seemed unchanged, but beneath the surface, a storm was gathering. Strange phenomena multiplied, unexplained disappearances, animals fleeing in terror, and eerie lights flickering over the forest at night. The town lived under an unspoken dread, a shadow that stretched from the heart of red pines to every street and alley. In the face of this growing darkness, hope seemed fragile. Yet, a few dared to hold on to it, seeking answers in old records, forgotten rituals, and the scattered fragments of the last patient's story. They understood that the key to stopping the evil lay not in brute force but in understanding the terrible history that bound the asylum and the dark presence together. The last patient's sacrifice had bought time, a fleeting moment in the endless night, but time was running out. The seal was weakening, the shadows growing bolder, and the night preparing to reclaim its dominion. The thin line between this world and the abyss trembled, threatening to shatter completely. And when it did, Red Pines would no longer be a prison for the darkness but a gateway. The darkness waits patiently, eternal and hungry. It knows that all things must end, that every light, no matter how bright, will eventually be swallowed by the night. The ember of resistance is fading, but it has not yet gone out. The final chapter is approaching. A cold stillness settled over the asylum, thick and suffocating. Time itself seemed to slow, every heartbeat echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. The walls that once echoed with cries and screams now held only faint murmurs, like distant voices trapped between worlds. The darkness was no longer subtle or hidden, it stretched its fingers through every crack and crevice, crawling closer with an unrelenting patience. The seal that had bound the ancient evil was faltering. Each pulse of the faint, dying glow grew weaker, the crimson symbols etched in dried blood barely visible beneath layers of grime. This was the final line of defense, the thin barrier between sanity and madness, between life and oblivion. And it was breaking. The last patient's spirit hovered near the seal, a flickering presence torn between worlds. Their sacrifice had anchored the barrier, but it had come at a devastating cost. Their form was less solid now, wavering like a candle's flame in a harsh wind, threatening to be extinguished entirely. They carried the weight of centuries, their souls stretched thin from endless vigilance. Within the asylum, shadows lengthened and twisted unnaturally. The very structure seemed to warp as if responding to the dark force it contained. Floors shifted beneath unsteady feet, doors appeared and vanished without warning, and the air grew colder with every passing moment. Those trapped inside found their senses betraying them, sounds distorting into sinister whispers and visions warping into nightmarish hallucinations. The staff had almost all disappeared. Some fled into the woods, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed. Others succumbed to the darkness within, their bodies found twisted in grotesque positions, faces frozen in terror. Few remained, driven by a fragile thread of duty or madness, desperately clinging to the remnants of hope. Outside, the forest stood silent but charged. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the asylum as if drawn by an unseen force. The locals, once dismissive, now spoke in hushed tones about the place, warning of a darkness that seeped beyond its walls, infecting dreams and twisting reality. Rumors spread of strange lights in the windows at night, ghostly figures roaming the perimeter, and a cold presence felt by all who dared approach. Animals avoided the area, and travelers reported an overwhelming sense of dread pressing down on their chests, as if the very air was heavy with unseen weight. The asylum had become a nexus where worlds collided, the living and the dead, the sane and the insane, reality and nightmare. The boundaries between these realms thinned, frayed by the relentless pressure of the dark entity waiting to break free. The building no longer belonged to the living, it was a prison, a battleground, a tomb. The last patient's spirit knew this all too well. Their existence was bound to the asylum's fate, a tether stretched taut by the conflict raging beneath the surface. They had fought to contain the darkness, to hold the line against oblivion, but every moment drained what little remained of their essence. In whispered voices, the darkness promised release, freedom from pain, suffering, and endless struggle. It offered power beyond comprehension to those desperate enough to accept. The temptation grew stronger with each passing day, and some within the asylum faltered, drawn toward the abyss. Yet, even as the shadow grew, a spark of resistance endured. Hidden deep within the asylum's bowels, ancient symbols glowed faintly, forgotten wards and protective charms etched long ago by hands that understood the true horror lurking beneath. These fragments of hope fought quietly against the encroaching night, fragile but persistent. The air hummed with anticipation. The final reckoning was near. The seal's weakening was a countdown, a warning etched in silence and blood. Soon, the darkness would surge forth, no longer restrained by mortal sacrifice or fading wards. The last patient's vigil was nearing its end. Their form grew more translucent, their power waning. The battle between light and dark teetered on the edge of oblivion, with the scales tipping ever closer to darkness. Beyond the asylum's walls, the world remained unaware of the impending storm. Yet the signs were unmistakable, cracks in reality, nightmares bleeding into waking hours, and a creeping sense of doom that no one could fully explain. The night was preparing to reclaim its dominion. When the darkness finally broke free, it would consume everything in its path. The asylum's haunted past would become a living nightmare for all, the last patient's sacrifice a fading echo lost to time. But for now, in the cold, suffocating silence, the fragile ember of resistance still burned. And that small flame was all that stood between the world and an endless night. The atmosphere inside Red Pines was charged with a palpable tension, as if the asylum itself was holding its breath. Every corridor hummed with a restless energy, a warning from the darkness lurking just beyond the thin veil of the weakening seal. The shadows stretched long and deep, slithering over cracked walls and peeling paint, creeping ever closer to breaking free from their ancient prison. The last patient's presence, once a steady guardian against the darkness, was fading like a dying ember. Their essence flickered, stretched thin by an eternal burden no one should have to bear. Time had frayed the bonds that held the evil at bay, and now the seal was but a fragile thread ready to snap. The patient's sacrifice had delayed the inevitable, but it had not stopped it. Whispers echoed through the asylum's silent halls, half-heard voices that carried warnings and promises both cruel and tempting. They crawled into the minds of the remaining few, twisting thoughts and warping realities. The boundary between what was real and what was nightmare grew perilously thin. Those who remained began to question their own senses, unsure if the creeping darkness was outside their walls or inside their minds. The asylum's architecture seemed to defy logic, twisting and folding like a grotesque puzzle. Doors led to nowhere, stairways spiraled into infinite darkness, and familiar rooms transformed into labyrinthine traps. It was as if the building itself had become an extension of the darkness, alive, malevolent, and hungry. Outside, the forest loomed like a silent sentinel, its gnarled branches clawing toward the sky. The trees whispered secrets in the wind, ancient warnings lost to time but understood by those who dared to listen. The air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories, as if nature itself mourned the evil buried beneath the asylum's foundations. The people of the nearby town lived in quiet fear. The stories they told were half-forgotten truths, tales of vanished patients, of screams swallowed by the night, and of a darkness that did not rest. They avoided the asylum's shadow like a plague, their eyes darting nervously whenever the topic arose. The unknown weighed heavy on their hearts, a dark cloud on the horizon they dared not face. Within the asylum, the struggle between light and darkness was reaching a fever pitch. The wards and protective symbols left by those who came before still flickered faintly in hidden corners, fragile defenses against an overwhelming force. These relics of hope were precious, but they were not enough. The darkness was patient, and it bided its time, waiting for the moment the seal would shatter completely. The last patient's spirit hovered near the fading seal, a spectral figure locked in an eternal vigil. Their form was barely visible, a faint glow in the gathering gloom. They fought a desperate battle to hold the darkness at bay, their will a fragile barrier against the encroaching void. Each moment drained their strength further, the line between existence and oblivion blurring with every breath. Voices from beyond the veil reached out to those trapped inside, some desperate, some malicious. They promised salvation through surrender, a release from pain into an eternity of dark bliss. The temptation was strong for the broken and the lost, and some faltered, their wills bending under the weight of the ancient lies. But not all had given in. A small, determined few clung to the fading light, seeking answers in the asylum's forgotten history and the scattered remnants of the patient's sacrifice. They searched for a way to strengthen the seal or banish the darkness forever. Their quest was desperate, shadowed by doubt and fear, but fueled by the faint hope that the nightmare might still end. The seal's weakening was a countdown, measured not in hours but in breaths and heartbeats. The darkness pressed closer, its hunger undeniable. The final battle was imminent, a reckoning that would decide the fate of Red Pines, and perhaps the world beyond its haunted walls. Beyond the asylum, the night held its breath. The world remained oblivious, but the threads of reality trembled, stretched to their breaking point. Shadows grew longer, dreams darker, and the night's silence louder. The darkness waited patiently, eternal and unyielding, for the moment it would rise. The last patient's sacrifice had bought time, but that time was nearly gone. The fragile ember of resistance flickered weakly, but it was still burning. And as the seal weakened, a question hung in the air: would that small flame be enough to hold back the night, or would Red Pines finally fall into the endless abyss? The answer was coming. The night deepened, pressing its cold fingers through every crack in the asylum's walls. The air was heavy with a silence so thick it felt suffocating, broken only by the faintest sound of shifting stone and the distant drip of water. The seal was unraveling faster now, its once vibrant red glow reduced to a weak, flickering pulse struggling to hold against the ever-growing pressure of the darkness. Inside, the last patient's fading spirit trembled under the immense weight of the evil contained within. The sacrifice had been immense, a lifetime stretched across moments, a soul worn thin by ceaseless vigilance. The patient's essence was almost translucent, a fragile thread barely tethering the nightmarish force below to the abyss. The longer the seal held, the more the darkness roared beneath the surface, desperate to escape and consume. The asylum's walls, steeped in history and torment, seemed to absorb the encroaching shadow. Cracks spiderwebbed along plaster and stone, spreading like veins carrying a poison that threatened to bleed through every corner of the building. Doors that had once been firmly shut now groaned open, revealing endless black voids where rooms once stood. The asylum itself had become a maze, a trap designed to ensnare and confuse, echoing the fractured minds it had once housed. Outside the building, the surrounding forest loomed ominously, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach toward the asylum like hungry claws. The wind carried whispers, not just the rustling of leaves but voices, ancient and sorrowful, warning and beckoning simultaneously. To the untrained ear, they sounded like madness, but those who had lived close to red pines for years recognized the calls. They spoke of things buried and forgotten, of curses old as time, and of a darkness that did not die. The town nearby was steeped in uneasy quiet. Life went on as normal during the day, but after sunset, the streets emptied quickly. People whispered stories over closed doors and locked windows, tales of strange lights flickering through asylum windows, shadowy figures slipping between trees, and a creeping sense of dread that clung like a second skin. No one spoke openly of what truly lay beneath red pines, but everyone knew to stay far away after dark. Within the asylum, the last patient fought an internal battle that was as brutal as any physical confrontation. The darkness clawed at their spirit relentlessly, promising release from suffering if only they would give in. It whispered of power beyond imagining, of freedom from pain, of an end to endless nights spent guarding a broken world. Every word was a poison, every promise a trap designed to shatter their will. Yet, despite the unbearable weight and the relentless onslaught, the patient clung to the faintest hope. The fragments of ancient wards scattered throughout the asylum shimmered faintly, tiny beacons in the overwhelming blackness. These remnants of forgotten magic were threads of salvation, fragile but undeniable. They pulsed with a faint warmth, a sign that all was not yet lost. A handful of survivors, few and scattered, moved cautiously through the crumbling corridors, drawn by the fading glow of these wards. Their footsteps were silent, their breaths shallow, each movement a battle against the suffocating fear that gripped the asylum. They sought to bolster the fading magic, to restore what had been lost, to hold the darkness at bay for just a little longer. Outside, the night deepened into an abyssal blackness, the stars swallowed by thick clouds. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. It was a night heavy with foreboding, one that pressed on the chest and chilled the bones. The darkness was no longer hidden, no longer waiting patiently, it was alive and watching, ready to surge forth. The last patient's fading light flickered weakly but defiantly. They were the final guardian of a fragile line between worlds, a beacon of resistance against an ancient evil seeking to drown everything in shadow. The battle was not just for the asylum or even the town nearby. It was a struggle for reality itself, a fight to keep the nightmare from spilling into the waking world. Time was running out. The seal's pulse grew fainter with each passing moment, the darkness pressing harder, its hunger insatiable. The last patient's strength waned, their existence hanging by a thread as thin as a whisper. The wards flickered, some fading entirely, others clinging desperately to their fading power. And then, in the suffocating silence, a single breath broke the stillness. A breath filled with resolve, with the will to fight, with the desperate hope that the night could still be held at bay. The last patient gathered the remnants of their strength, their spirit burning brighter for a fleeting moment against the encroaching shadow. The final confrontation was close, an inevitable storm on the horizon, ready to consume all that lay in its path. But within that darkness, a spark still glimmered, fragile but unyielding. And sometimes, that was enough. The walls of red pine seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, a heartbeat in sync with the fading seal that bound the darkness below. Every crack, every creaking floorboard, whispered secrets of the horrors trapped beneath the asylum's foundations. Time had twisted into something unrecognizable here, stretching and folding like the warped halls themselves. The boundary between past and present blurred, and the echoes of suffering reverberated endlessly. The last patient remained the fragile bulwark against oblivion. Their essence was a trembling flame, fragile and flickering, but unextinguished. The dark force beneath the asylum surged with growing impatience, an ancient malevolence craving release. It clawed at the seams of the fragile barrier, gnashing teeth unseen, promising devastation beyond comprehension. Memories flooded the last patient's consciousness, fragmented flashes of others who had come before, souls lost to the darkness in desperate attempts to contain it. Each sacrifice left a scar, a weakening of the bonds holding the nightmare at bay. The weight of countless lives pressed down, a suffocating legacy of pain and failure. Yet surrender was unthinkable. To yield meant extinction, not only of themselves but of everything beyond these cursed walls. The wards, inscribed in long-forgotten languages, flickered weakly in the shadows. They were threads of hope woven by ancestors who understood the terror better than any living soul. Their power was waning, drained by decades of struggle and neglect. Still, these faint glimmers held the asylum together, weaving a fragile tapestry of resistance against the growing void. Outside, the night stretched endless and merciless. The forest encircling red pines stood like sentinels draped in shadow, branches twisting toward the sky as if to choke the stars themselves. The wind carried voices, half-formed words that seemed to call out from the abyss. To the town beyond, these whispers were rumors, dismissed as superstition. But in the darkness, they were warnings. The nightmare was stirring, rising. Those who dared remain inside the asylum fought against despair. Each step was weighed down by fear, each breath a battle for calm. They searched desperately for any way to reinforce the weakening seal, poring over dusty tomes and crumbling journals, seeking knowledge long buried beneath layers of madness and decay. Their resolve was fierce but fragile, threatened by the encroaching darkness that sought to consume their very souls. The last patient's spirit pulsed in time with the failing wards, a heartbeat struggling to keep pace with a storm that threatened to break loose. Every moment brought the shadow closer, every breath a countdown to oblivion. The air grew thick with tension, charged with an energy so oppressive it pressed like a physical weight on lungs and hearts alike. In this silent war, hope was a whispered prayer. The darkness was cunning and relentless, twisting reality itself to shatter minds and bend wills. It promised release but delivered only despair and endless torment. It fed on fear, growing stronger as the walls weakened, its hunger insatiable. Yet, amidst the despair, a spark of resistance remained. The last patient's sacrifice was not in vain. Their presence anchored the fragile boundary between worlds, a luminous thread in a tapestry unraveling at the edges. It was a light small and flickering but powerful in its defiance. The final hours approached with merciless certainty. The darkness pressed harder, gnawing at the seal like a beast trapped too long. It whispered promises of freedom, of power beyond imagining, tempting any who would listen to give in. The last patient held firm, a sentinel standing alone against the encroaching night. Outside, the town lay silent beneath a sky devoid of stars. The world seemed to hold its breath, caught between what was and what might be. The nightmare beneath red pines waited for the moment to rise, its hunger vast and eternal. But for now, the flame of resistance burned on, fragile, flickering, but unbroken. The question hung heavy in the air: would that last flicker of light be enough to hold back the darkness, or would red pines finally succumb to the endless void? The answer was near. The night stretched into an endless abyss as the final moments drew near. The darkness beneath red pines was no longer merely pressing at the edges, it surged like a living storm, violent and merciless. Its hunger was a force beyond comprehension, a force that sought to shatter the fragile barrier between worlds and swallow everything whole. Time had lost meaning, measured only by the fading strength of the last patient's flickering light. The air thickened with an almost tangible pressure, as if the very atmosphere was being squeezed by an unseen hand. The wards, ancient and worn, sputtered like dying stars, their power nearly spent. Every heartbeat of the last patient was a battle cry against the overwhelming void, a desperate plea to hold fast against the coming storm. Memories collided in the patient's mind, echoes of lives lost, sacrifices made in the endless cycle of containment. Each soul who had stood guard before had been consumed, their strength absorbed into the darkness, fueling its insatiable appetite. The legacy of red pines was one of endless war, an eternal prison built on pain and sacrifice. Yet within this cycle, the last patient found something unexpected, a spark of hope, a flicker of defiance burning brighter than any before. The darkness roared beneath the surface, a deafening howl that shook the very foundations of the asylum. It clawed at the walls, fracturing stone and mortar, spreading fissures like veins pulsing with corruption. The seal that had held it captive for decades weakened with each passing second. The patient's spirit trembled but did not break, anchored by an unyielding will that refused to surrender. Outside, the world waited in terrified silence. The forest around red pines was alive with restless shadows, the wind carrying cries that twisted into screams, voices of the lost trapped between realms. The stars had vanished behind a curtain of storm clouds, leaving only the oppressive blackness that mirrored the abyss below. Within the asylum, the wards flickered for a final time, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the crumbling walls. The last patient reached deep within, summoning every fragment of strength remaining. Their essence flared like a beacon in the consuming dark, a pulse of light against the overwhelming void. It was a final act of resistance, a stand to hold the nightmare at bay just a little longer. The darkness surged forward, a tidal wave of malevolent energy that threatened to overwhelm everything. But the patient's will was a fortress, a shield forged from pain, hope, and endless determination. In those final moments, the battle was not just for the asylum, but for the world beyond, for every soul unaware of the terror waiting beneath their feet. Time slowed, stretched to an unbearable length as the forces clashed. The last patient's light burned brighter, pushing back the shadows with a fierce intensity. The darkness screamed in rage, its hunger momentarily denied. The seal, fragile and flickering, held. And then, with a sudden stillness, the storm ceased. The darkness receded like a tide pulled back by an unseen hand. The asylum settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the patient's shallow breaths, the pulse of a fragile victory. The cost was written in every crack in the walls, every faded ward, every shattered soul. The last patient's light was dim, barely a flicker now, but it remained, a testament to the price paid, the sacrifice made to keep the nightmare caged. Outside, the first light of dawn began to pierce the horizon, softening the shadows and bathing red pines in a pale, uncertain glow. The nightmare was not gone, merely held back, a slumbering beast waiting for the next moment of weakness. But for now, the asylum stood silent and still, its horrors contained, its darkest secrets locked away once more. The last patient remained, weary, broken, but unyielding, the final guardian of a fragile peace forged in darkness. The story of Red Pines was far from over. The darkness waited, patient and eternal, but so too did the light, fragile, flickering, and forever defiant. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Red Pines Asylum. If you found yourself captivated by the chilling mystery and the silent battles fought in the dark, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of the haunting tales I share here. If you want more stories like this, stories that blend true crime and horror to help you unwind and drift into a deep sleep, just let me know in the comments. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating these immersive experiences. Remember, sometimes the darkest places hide the brightest lights, and sometimes, the bravest hearts are those that stand against the night. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story. Good night.